Hello, everybody. I'm going to start out by briefly addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on our cities and especially our public spaces. And I know this is something that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And what I hope is that this is a kind of teachable moment to remind us about what's always been most important about cities and about public space networks. And so with this discussion, I'm hoping that that'll set the stage for us to talk a little more about mid-block passages more specifically. Um, Although we've seen density getting a bad name in this pandemic, I think that misses the point that the real issue is the pattern of connectivity. And I'll give you an example to illustrate that point. Here's a famous drawing from the Urban Task Force in the UK with three scenarios of very different urban forms with exactly the same density. The towers in the park, row houses, and then perimeter blocks, all with exactly 30 units to the acre, 75 units to the hectare. But this pattern of connectivity and human contact is very different in each. And as I think you can readily appreciate, so is the likely pattern of viral transmission. In the towers in the park, for example, people are going to find it very hard to practice social distancing with the centralized elevators and lobbies and exits and so on, in comparison to the more diffuse patterns of the row houses, for example, or even the perimeter blocks, which have smaller elevator cores, perhaps. Similarly, in thinking about mid-block passages, we need to understand that they can be quite diffuse as part of a network pattern. And where people do have to come into contact, we can create, in effect, what amount to queuing spaces where people can pass each other safely. So it is possible to be safe in high quality urban environments, public spaces, and to practice what I call sociable distancing with things like the time-honored front porch and stoops and frontage zones and so on and so forth that connect as well as separate, all under the user's control. And after all, let's just remember that urban space needs to protect us as well as to connect us. And that means that it needs to exclude as well as to include. And it has to do that at a variety of scales of space and time. And it has to empower the users to control their connectivity across a variety of scales. And of course, that's what any room does, right? We have the ability to control our privacy and our connectivity. We can open doors and close windows and draw blinds and so on. And we can make larger changes over time. We can remodel the house, for example. And that room-like structure goes right out into urban spaces, right? With hedges and gates and stoops and seating areas and so on and so forth, all part of this place network. So let me show you a little more of what I mean with an example here. It's a composite photo of a fairly ordinary street near where I used to live in London. And if you look at all the places where you can be or move or see or hear or not move or see but not hear or hear but not see, it's quite a dizzying network of connections and modulations and membrane-like spaces evolving and changing from the most private rooms to the most public urban rooms on the street. And it's changing over the span of a few hours when people are opening doors and closing windows and so on, and also over the spans of years. And in the middle, you can see when I went back, and after 5 years, you can see many different small transformations where they've added new outdoor terrace railings, new planters articulating an entranceway, the cafe seating is gone, many small transformations of this place network. And even larger changes happen over the span of centuries, as you can see in the rather boring cadastral plan of Venice at the top right. And then about a century later, the much more complex, intricate pattern that we all know and love, and all built up by these intricate actions over time. And of course, it's not that this process happens without design, but that we as designers need to respect and empower and interweave with this self-organization process that's going on and with its patterns. And I think that's a different way of thinking about design, and actually a more powerful one as well. And we can see that weaving and learn from it in the patterns of many different cities where we have mid-block passages like this beautiful example in Ronda, Spain, the sort of capillary structure, or in more formal examples like Meisner's Worth Avenue in Palm Beach. Many of us know this example with its capillary patterns and courtyards and so on, or in Taylor's Espanola Way, which I think most of you also know. Again, lots of little capillary passages and spaces. And Chris Alexander has advocated a similar kind of pattern as an alternative to the mechanically repeating block, as you can see from this drawing from The Nature of Order. And again, some examples that Lawrence and Ross and I have done for clients. And here's a couple of examples from Arizona. And a couple of other examples from Chris Alexander. Again, you see this fine-grained capillary structure and these little passageways that connect and create this intricate hierarchy. Well, so those examples tend to emphasize the designed aspects of these spaces, but what about a more process-oriented approach? So I'll close with this example from York in the UK, and a simulation exercise that we did with some students a few years ago at the Princess Foundation. And York has this wonderful mid-block feature called a snickleway in the local terminology. And it's this very fine capillary structure that extends throughout the old city. And it's a very beautiful structure with wonderful spaces, often with shops and pubs and other retail uses, as well as residences and offices. So what we did in our exercise was to simulate the process that actually generated these places over time, the craft-based process, with not only architects, but other craftspeople. And the students would take on those roles of shaping and transforming the space and simulating this culture of building, as you might call it. So we started with this example, this kind of alien invader modernist project that was inserted into the fabric very rudely, I would say. And our job was to pretend that it wasn't there and to restore the patterns of that area. How would we do that? How would we restore the snickleway pattern and so on? And what would be our approach to creating those kinds of fine-grained capillary structures and other spaces from the public to the private? And that was our challenge to the students. And here's some of the work, very intricate, fine-grained stuff, as you can see. And here's an entrance along the streetscape with an elevation that picks up on some of the patterns of the area and so on. So clearly there's a lot to learn from what we might call the DNA of place, of all these places, not only in their physical forms, but also in the processes and the patterns that shape them into such successful, enduring, beautiful human environments. And clearly they're sustainable environments because they have in fact sustained. So I see no real reason that we can't build our own generation today of similarly beautiful and sustainable habitats following the same kinds of patterns and processes. Thank you.